The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the presidential compound in Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window of his modest office, his military uniform crisp despite the relentless heat that pressed against the capital like a heavy blanket. The weight of leadership had carved itself into his features over the past months, a burden he carried with the same discipline he had learned in the artillery regiment, but one that sometimes threatened to crush even his resolute spirit. His aide, Captain Ouedraogo, knocked softly before entering. The man's face was tight with the same exhaustion that plagued everyone in the compound these days. Too many sleepless nights monitoring security situations, too many reports of attacks in the northern provinces, too many decisions that held lives in the balance. "Sir, the security briefing for tomorrow morning has been moved to 8:00, Ouedraogo announced, clutching a folder thick with documents, "and the ministers are requesting another emergency session about the situation in Soum province." Traoré nodded without turning from the window. Beyond the compound walls, Ouagadougou bustled with evening activity, merchants closing their stalls, children playing soccer in dusty lots, the call to prayer echoing from minarets across the city, life continuing despite everything. That resilience was what he loved most about his people, but it was also what made his responsibility so overwhelming. Every decision he made rippled through millions of lives. "Tell them we'll meet on Thursday," he said finally. "I need time to think clearly about the northern strategy." Ouedraogo hesitated, an unusual occurrence for the typically efficient officer. "Sir, there's something else. I received a message from my cousin in the East region. He says if you ever need to step away for a moment, to clear your mind, his village would be honored to host you. It's very remote, very quiet." Traoré turned to face his aide, studying the man's earnest expression. The suggestion was unprecedented. The president didn't simply disappear to rural villages without extensive security preparations, advance teams, and official protocols. Yet something in Ouedraogo's words struck a chord deep within him. "How remote?" he asked. "4 hours by road from Fadangourma, sir. The village is called Tangaye. Population maybe 300. My cousin is the village chief. Good man. Served in the military before returning home. He says the people there live simply, but with dignity." That word, dignity, it was the word Sankara had used, the word embedded in the very name of their nation, Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. Sometimes Traoré wondered if he was upholding that legacy or drowning in it. "No security detail?" Traoré asked. "Sir, I wouldn't recommend—" "I'm asking hypothetically, Captain." Ouedraogo shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "The village is so isolated that it rarely sees outsiders. The terrain is difficult. My cousin says, well, he says they have their own ways of staying safe out there." That phrase lingered in Traoré's mind long after Ouedraogo had left. Their own ways of staying safe. In a country where safety had become the most precious commodity, where entire communities lived under the shadow of violence, the idea of a place that maintained its own security through unknown methods was intriguing. He returned to the window, watching as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. In 2 hours, he would attend another dinner with foreign dignitaries. Tomorrow, more meetings about military deployments, resource allocations, political negotiations. The machinery of government ground forward relentlessly, and he was the engine that kept it running. But engines needed maintenance. Even he could admit that much. That night, unable to sleep, Traoré made a decision that would have scandalized his security team if they had known about it in advance. He would go to this village, this Tangaye, not as the president, not as the military leader, not as the symbol of a nation's hopes. He would go as simply Ibrahim, a man who needed to remember what it felt like to breathe without the weight of millions pressing down on his chest. He composed a brief message to Ouedraogo. "Arrange it. Minimal security. I want to arrive unannounced. 3 days only." As he sent the message, Traoré felt something he hadn't experienced in months, anticipation unmarred by dread. Whatever awaited him in Tangaye, it would at least be different from the suffocating routine of crisis management that had become his life. He didn't know it yet, but this decision would teach him more about leadership, courage, and the resilience of his people than any military operation or political strategy session ever could. In seeking an escape, he would find a mirror. In searching for simplicity, he would discover profound complexity. And in a village where everyone locked their doors at sunset, he would learn the truest meaning of standing upright in the face of fear. Chapter 2. The journey to Tangaye began before dawn, when Ouagadougou was still wrapped in the cool embrace of night. Traoré dressed in civilian clothes, simple cotton pants and a worn shirt that he'd kept from his days as a young officer. Looking at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. Without the uniform, without the presidential insignia, he looked like any other Burkinabe man in his 30s, tired, perhaps, but ordinary. Captain Ouedraogo had arranged for a single vehicle, an old Land Cruiser that had seen better days but was reliable on rough roads. The driver was a taciturn sergeant from the East region who asked no questions and spoke only when necessary. Traoré appreciated the silence as they navigated through the sleeping capital and onto the highway heading east. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, they left behind the paved roads and modern buildings. The landscape transformed into the familiar terrain of the Burkinabe countryside, vast stretches of savanna punctuated by occasional baobab trees, their massive trunks standing like ancient sentinels. Small villages appeared and disappeared, clusters of earthen homes with thatched or corrugated metal roofs. Children already awake and heading toward wells with plastic containers balanced on their heads. Traoré watched it all through the window, feeling something loosen in his chest. This was the Burkina Faso that existed beyond the security briefings and international news coverage. These were the people he fought for every day, not abstract citizens, but real individuals living real lives, working the land, raising families, finding joy despite hardship. They stopped briefly in Fada Ngourma to refuel and purchase supplies. The city was already alive with activity, the market bustling with vendors selling everything from fresh vegetables to traditional medicines, the air thick with the aroma of grilled meat and spices. A few people glanced at the Land Cruiser with mild curiosity, but no one recognized Traoré. He pulled his cap lower over his eyes anyway, unwilling to break the spell of anonymity. From Fada Ngourma, they turned onto progressively smaller roads until they were following what could barely be called a path, 2 tire tracks winding through scrubland, occasionally crossing dry riverbeds or skirting around massive termite mounds that rose like earthen skyscrapers from the ground. "How much further?" Traoré asked as they bounced over another series of ruts. 2 hours, sir," the driver replied. "The chief knows we're coming. He'll meet us at the village entrance." The landscape grew more austere as they traveled deeper into the east region. Here, the earth was reddish-brown, the vegetation sparse except for clusters of hardy acacia trees. The heat intensified, and Traoré could see waves of it rising from the ground in shimmering distortions. This was harsh country, demanding resilience from everything that tried to survive here. Finally, as the sun approached its zenith, they crested a small rise, and Traoré saw Tangaye for the first time. The village was a collection of perhaps 60 structures spread across a shallow valley, most built from mud bricks with traditional architecture, round huts with conical thatched roofs interspersed with more modern rectangular buildings. A few scattered trees provided what shade existed, their branches reaching out like welcoming arms. What struck Traoré immediately was the sense of order. Unlike some villages he'd visited, Tangaye seemed meticulously organized, with clear paths between dwellings and what appeared to be communal areas carefully maintained. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite identify. A quality to the light, perhaps, or the way the buildings seemed to huddle together despite the available space. As they descended toward the village, a man emerged from the largest structure at the center of the settlement. He was perhaps 50, with a weathered face that spoke of decades under the Sahelian sun. But his posture was straight and his movements had the precision of someone with military training. Chief Sawadogo, Traoré presumed. The Land Cruiser came to a stop near the village entrance, and Traoré stepped out, immediately feeling the full force of the midday heat. Chief Sawadogo approached with measured steps, his eyes taking in Traoré with a single assessing glance that seemed to see everything: the civilian clothes, the presidential bearing they couldn't quite hide, the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. "Welcome to Tangaye," the chief said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, calloused from work. "My cousin spoke highly of you, though he was modest about your position. We are honored to host you." "Thank you, Chief Sawadogo," I'm grateful for your hospitality. I hope my presence won't cause any inconvenience. Something flickered in the chief's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or knowing. Inconvenience is relative in Tangaye. We have learned to accommodate many things. Come, let me show you where you'll stay. As they walked through the village, Traoré noticed details that reinforced his initial impression of organization. The paths were swept clean of debris. Water vessels were neatly arranged near dwellings. A few children played in a shaded area, their laughter bright against the quiet afternoon, but they stayed close to the buildings, never venturing into the open spaces. The village seems very well maintained, Traoré observed. Discipline, Chief Sawadago replied simply. In difficult times, discipline is what separates survival from chaos. They reached a small guest house on the edge of the village, a simple structure with thick mud walls and a sturdy wooden door. Inside, it was surprisingly cool, the earthen construction providing natural insulation against the heat. A sleeping mat had been prepared, along with a clay water vessel and basic amenities. You'll find everything you need here, the chief said. We eat our main meal in the evening, around sunset. Someone will come to fetch you. Until then, please rest. Traoré nodded his thanks, but as the chief turned to leave, he found himself asking, Chief Sawadago, may I walk around the village? I'd like to see how people live here. The chief paused, his hand on the doorframe. For a moment, his expression grew grave, and Traoré saw something in his eyes that he recognized from countless military briefings, the look of a man carrying knowledge he wished he didn't have. Of course, the chief said finally, but I must ask one thing of you. When the sun begins to set, return to this house immediately and secure the door. Do not open it for anyone until morning, regardless of what you might hear. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Traoré felt his pulse quicken, old instincts awakening. Chief, what happens at night in Tangaye? Nothing that concerns our daytime guest, Chief Sawadago replied, his tone gentle but firm. Please, respect our customs. We have survived this long by following certain practices. Before Traoré could press further, the chief was gone, leaving him alone in the quiet coolness of the guest house, with more questions than he'd arrived with, and the distinct feeling that his search for simplicity had just become considerably more complicated. Chapter 3. Traoré spent the afternoon exploring Tangaye, and with each passing hour, his curiosity deepened. The village operated with a rhythm unlike any he'd encountered, purposeful, efficient, but underlaid with something he couldn't quite name. It was like watching a well-rehearsed performance where everyone knew their part perfectly, yet no one acknowledged they were acting. He met Madame Caboret, an elderly woman who sat in the shade weaving baskets from dried grass, her fingers moving with practiced grace despite their gnarled appearance. When he stopped to admire her work, she smiled up at him with a warmth that reminded him of his own grandmother. "You're the visitor Chief Sawadago mentioned," she said, not posing it as a question. "From the city. Yes, you have that look about you, like you've forgotten what it means to sit still." Traoré smiled despite himself. "Is it that obvious?" "The city changes people," she replied, returning to her weaving. "So it makes them think movement equals progress. Here we know better. Sometimes standing still is the bravest thing you can do." He wanted to ask what she meant, but a group of children ran past, laughing as they chased a makeshift soccer ball fashioned from plastic bags and twine. One boy, perhaps 7 or 8 up, stumbled and fell near Traoré, scraping his knee on the hard-packed earth. Before the child could cry, an older girl, his sister, Traoré guessed, was there, helping him up with gentle efficiency. "Careful, Solimane," she scolded softly. "You know better than to run so fast this late in the afternoon. Come on, let's get you cleaned up before—" She stopped abruptly, glancing at the sun's position in the sky, then at Traoré. "Before what?" Traoré asked. But the girl was already shepherding her brother away, moving with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to a scraped knee. As the afternoon wore on, Traoré began to notice patterns. People worked with intensity, but also with constant awareness of the sun's position. Conversations would break off mid-sentence as someone glanced westward, as if checking an invisible clock. Men working in distant fields began returning to the village earlier than seemed necessary for the amount of daylight remaining. He found Chief Sawadago near the village well, supervising the evening water collection. The chief's nephew, a young man named Yakuba, who had studied in Ouagadougou before returning home, was helping organize the vessels and distribute the water equitably. "So, Chief, may I ask you something?" Traoré ventured, approaching carefully. Ouagadougou looked up, reading something in Traoré's expression. "You've been observing. Good. Observation is the first step toward understanding. Everyone here seems prepared for something. The way they watch the sun, how they hurry as evening approaches. And last night, you mentioned I shouldn't open my door regardless of what I hear. Chief, I've been a soldier. I recognize the signs of a community living under threat. What threatens Tangaye?" The chief was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. Finally, he gestured toward a large baobab tree at the village's edge, its massive trunk scarred with what looked like old claw marks, though Traoré knew no animal in Burkina Faso could make such marks. "Walk with me," Ouagadougou said. They moved away from the well, toward the perimeter of the village. As they walked, the chief began to speak, his voice low and measured. 3 years ago, Tangaye was like any other village in this region. We had our challenges, drought, poverty, the usual struggles of rural life, but we were safe. Then the troubles in the north began to spread. You know about this, I think." Traoré nodded. The jihadist insurgency had been the central crisis of his presidency, a cancer that metastasized across Burkina Faso's northern and eastern regions, consuming villages and lives with indiscriminate violence. "Armed groups passed through this area," Ouagadougou continued. "They took supplies, sometimes people. The gendarmerie couldn't protect us. They were stretched too thin. And when they did come, sometimes they were worse than the militants themselves." This last comment made Traoré wince. He knew about the allegations of security force abuses, the terrible cycle of violence and reprisal that fed the insurgency as much as ideology did. "We formed our own defense," the chief went on. "Many villages did. The Kogelwogo, we called ourselves guardians of the bush, young men with hunting rifles and machetes trying to protect their families." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But we learned quickly that weapons alone don't keep you safe, not against enemies who strike from shadows, who can disappear into the land like smoke." They had reached the baobab tree now, and Traoré could see the marks more clearly. They weren't claw marks. They were bullet holes, dozens of them, pocking the ancient trunk like some obscene disease. 6 months ago, the armed groups came to Tangaye properly, Ouagadougou said, placing his hand on the scarred tree. "They arrived at sunset, when we were all still outside, finishing our day. They opened fire. 9 people died in the first minutes. Men, women, 2 children. Right here, at this tree." Traoré felt the blood drain from his face. This was the reality he knew existed. The statistics in his briefings made flesh and memory. "The survivors ran to their homes," the chief continued, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. "Those who made it inside and locked their doors, they lived. The militants spent the night in the village, looting, destroying, but they couldn't break through the doors. Our traditional architecture, the thick mud walls and heavy wooden doors, they held. By dawn, the attackers had left." "Chief, I'm sorry. I didn't know—" "How could you?" Ouagadougou interrupted gently. "We didn't report it. No police came to investigate. No newspapers wrote about it. We were just another village, another statistic, so we adapted. The custom of locking doors at sunset," Traoré said, understanding dawning. "Yes, now every day as the sun begins to set, everyone returns to their homes and secures their doors. We don't emerge until sunrise. It's become our way of life, our survival. The armed groups have passed through twice more since then, but they've found a ghost village. No targets in the open, no easy prey. Eventually, they moved on to softer targets." The weight of this revelation settled over Traoré like a heavy cloak. Here, in this small village, people lived under a self-imposed nightly curfew, prisoners in their own homes from dusk to dawn, all because the state he led couldn't protect them. "Why didn't you ask for help?" he asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "From whom?" Ouagadougou replied, not unkindly. "The government has larger problems. The military is fighting on multiple fronts. We learned to protect ourselves because no one else would. It's not bitterness," went President Traoré. "Yes, I know who you are. My cousin may be discreet, but I'm not blind. It's simply reality." Traoré stood speechless. The chief had known all along. had welcomed him anyway, shown him hospitality anyway, even while living with the consequences of government failures. "I should go," Traoré said, shame and anger warring in his chest, anger at the situation, shame at his own powerlessness in the face of it. "No," Ouagadougou said firmly, "you asked for 3 days, and you'll have them, but you'll follow our customs. When the sun sets, you lock yourself in, and you'll hear things tonight, footsteps, voices perhaps. You'll want to help. Don't. Some battles are fought with doors and patience, not guns and heroics." The sun was already touching the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Around them, Traoré could hear the acceleration of activity, people calling children home, doors creaking open and shut, the sounds of a community retreating into itself. "Come," the chief said, "I'll walk you back to your guest house. And President Traoré, welcome to the real Burkina Faso." Chapter 4. The sun disappeared below the horizon with shocking speed, as if eager to abandon Tangaye to whatever the darkness held. Traoré stood inside the guest house, his hand on the heavy wooden door, watching through the gap as the last sliver of orange light vanished. Chief Ouagadougou had left him 10 minutes earlier, and already the village had transformed into something alien. Every door sealed, every window shuttered, no movement in the paths between buildings. The silence was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of evening in a rural village, but something else entirely. A held breath, a collective waiting. Traoré found himself thinking of his military deployments, the tense hours before an engagement, when every sense heightened to preternatural sharpness. He secured the door as instructed, sliding the heavy wooden beam into its brackets. The mechanism was well made, clearly designed for security rather than mere privacy. The windows had interior shutters reinforced with metal bars. This wasn't architecture designed for comfort. It was architecture designed for siege. Inside, a small oil lamp provided flickering light. Chief Ouagadougou had left him a simple meal, a thick millet paste, with sauce and some dried fish. Traoré ate mechanically, his mind churning through everything he'd learned. He was the president of Burkina Faso, commander of its armed forces, the man responsible for protecting citizens like those in Tangaye. Yet he hadn't even known this village existed, let alone the nightly ritual that governed its survival. How many other villages lived this way? How many communities had developed their own coping mechanisms for violence that outpaced the state's ability to respond? The questions multiplied, each one a small indictment. He was settling onto the sleeping mat when he heard it, the first sound from outside since darkness fell. Footsteps, not the confident stride of someone walking with purpose, but something irregular, almost shuffling. They passed near his door, close enough that he could hear the scuff of feet on packed earth. Traoré froze, every muscle tensing. He had no weapon, had deliberately left his service pistol behind in Ouagadougou as part of this exercise in simplicity. Now that decision seemed foolish. He moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the shutter. Nothing. Just darkness so complete it seemed solid, impenetrable. But the footsteps continued, circling the guest house, and now he heard voices, low murmuring in a language he couldn't quite make out. Were they speaking Moore, Fulfulde, or something else entirely? The voices grew louder, more agitated. There was laughter too, harsh and mocking. Then came the sound he'd been dreading, hands testing his door, pushing against it, rattling the beam. The wood creaked, but held. Every instinct screamed at him to act. In his military career, Traoré had learned that initiative often meant survival. Waiting passively while an enemy tested your defenses went against everything his training had hammered into him. His hand moved toward the door beam before he consciously decided to move. But then he remembered Chief Ouagadougou's words. Some battles are fought with doors and patience, not guns and heroics. Traoré forced himself to step back from the door, forced his breathing to slow, his hands to unclench. This was a different kind of courage than he was used to, not the courage to act, but the courage to trust in something beyond his own abilities. The rattling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then came a voice, clearer than the others, speaking in perfect French. "We know you're in there. We know you're not from this village. Open the door, and we'll make this quick." Traoré's blood ran cold. They knew about him. How? Had someone betrayed his presence? Was this a targeted attack on the president, or just random intimidation that happened to strike at an outsider? More voices joined the first, creating a chorus of threats and promises. They described what they would do if he opened the door, how they would make him suffer, how resistance was futile. The psychological warfare was sophisticated, designed to break will through fear, but something wasn't right. Traoré had been in enough combat situations to recognize authenticity, and something about this felt performed. The voices were threatening, yes, but there was a quality to them he couldn't identify, like actors playing a role they'd rehearsed many times. Then came a sound that nearly shattered his resolve, a child's scream, high and terrified, coming from somewhere nearby in the village. It cut through the night like a knife, followed by sobbing and pleading. Traoré's hand was back on the doorbeam before he'd made a conscious decision. A child was in danger. Nothing else mattered. He started to lift the beam. "Don't!" The voice came from inside the guest house, soft but commanding. Traoré spun around, reaching for a weapon he didn't have, and found himself face to face with a young woman who'd somehow entered through a back room he hadn't noticed. She was perhaps 25, wearing traditional clothing, her eyes sharp and intelligent in the lamplight. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" "My name is Aminata, and there's a connecting passage between most buildings in Tangaye," another adaptation. "As for why I'm here, it's to keep you from doing something foolish. There's a child out there." "There's no child," Aminata said flatly. "It's a recording they play. The militants figured out years ago that screaming children break resistance faster than any threat. But Chief Sawadogo's grandchildren are safe in his house, as are all the village children. The sounds you hear are meant to make you open that door." Traoré stared at her, trying to process this information. "They use recordings. They use everything. Recorded voices, threats, promises, false cries for help. They've learned that psychological torture works better than battering rams. People will open their doors to save a child they think is dying outside, and once a door opens—" She didn't finish the sentence. "How do you know so much about their tactics?" Aminata's expression hardened. "Because I survived them once. I was visiting from Ouagadougou, here to see my grandmother. When they attacked, I opened my door to help someone I thought was injured. They weren't. I learned that night that survival sometimes means being willing to seem heartless." The noises outside continued, the recording of the child's screams looping, the voices making threats, the footsteps circling. But now that Traoré knew it was psychological warfare, he found he could distance himself from the emotional response, analyze it tactically. "How long does this go on?" he asked. "Depends on the night. Sometimes until midnight, sometimes until just before dawn. They know we won't come out, so mostly they're just reminding us that they're still out there, still in control of the darkness." Traoré moved away from the door, sitting heavily on the sleeping mat. Aminata settled across from him, her posture relaxed despite the chaos outside. "The chief sent you," Traoré said. It wasn't a question. "He thought you might need someone to talk to help you understand what you're experiencing. Most visitors don't last the first night before they try to open their doors, and if I had, I would have stopped you, or tried to. Opening that door puts the entire village at risk. If they breach one house, they'll try all the others. Our collective security depends on no one breaking." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds outside. The recording changed. Now it was someone calling for help in Moore, claiming to be injured, begging for water. The attention to detail was chilling. "How do the people here maintain this every single night?" Traoré finally asked. "The psychological toll must be enormous." Aminata's expression softened slightly. "You adapt. The first weeks are hardest. People have nightmares, children develop anxiety, but humans are remarkably resilient. We develop routines, find comfort in the ritual of securing our homes, and we support each other during the day, share the burden of what we endure at night. This isn't how people should have to live." "No," Aminata agreed quietly, "but it's better than dying. We've learned to find life in the daylight hours, to compress all our joy and connection and humanity into the time between dawn and dusk. It's not ideal, but it's survival." Outside, the voices reached a crescendo, then suddenly cut off. The silence that followed was somehow more unsettling than the noise had been. Traoré found himself straining to hear any sound, any indication of what was happening out there. "They do that too," Aminata said. "The sudden silence makes you think they've left, makes you want to check. Don't..." How do you know they haven't? I don't. None of us do. That's part of what they exploit. Our uncertainty. Our desperate hope that tonight might be the night they actually leave us in peace. They talked through much of the night, Aminata sharing stories of life in Tangaye, the way the community had adapted to their reality, the small resistances they maintained. She spoke of her grandmother, who refused to let the nightly siege stop her from teaching the children during the day, from maintaining traditions and passing on knowledge. Resilience isn't just about surviving, Aminata said, as the first hints of pre-dawn light began to seep through the shutter gaps. It's about refusing to let fear take everything from you. They can control our nights, but they can't have our days. They can make us lock our doors, but they can't make us stop being human behind those doors. When dawn finally broke, flooding the world with light and releasing Tangaye from its nightly prison, Traoré heard the sounds of doors opening, of life cautiously resuming. Aminata stood to leave through the same passage she'd entered. "Thank you," Traoré said, "for keeping me from making a terrible mistake." "Don't thank me yet," Aminata replied. "You still have 2 more nights, and each one teaches different lessons." After she left, Traoré opened his own door and stepped out into the morning. The village looked exactly as it had the previous day, peaceful, orderly, giving no sign of the psychological warfare that had raged through the darkness. But he knew better now. He understood what Chief Sawadogo had meant about standing still being the bravest thing. This was courage too, not the dramatic courage of charging into battle, but the quiet, relentless courage of enduring, of choosing survival over heroism, of protecting community through collective discipline rather than individual bravery. President Ibrahim Traoré had come to Tangaye seeking simplicity, an escape from complexity. Instead, he'd found a masterclass in the kind of leadership he'd never learned in any military academy, the leadership of people who protected each other through adherence to hard rules, who found strength not in weapons, but in unity, who turned their vulnerability into a kind of defensive armor through sheer force of will, and he'd only completed 1 night out of 3. Das to Madame Tiwas, Chapter 5. The morning in Tangaye unfolded with a normalcy that seemed impossible, given what Traoré had experienced during the night. Children emerged from their homes laughing, running toward a makeshift school under a large mango tree. Women gathered at the well, their conversations punctuated by the rhythmic sound of water being drawn from the depths. Men headed toward distant fields, hoes balanced on shoulders, discussing the prospects for rain. It was as if the darkness and all it contained had been sealed away in some separate reality, acknowledged but not discussed in the daylight hours. Traoré watched this deliberate compartmentalization with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. This was trauma management on a community level, functional but at what cost? He found Chief Sawadogo at the communal area, a large open space near the center of the village where people gathered for important matters. The chief was settling a dispute between 2 men over land boundaries, listening to each side with patient attention before offering a judgment that both parties accepted with respectful nods. When the men departed, Sawadogo gestured for Traoré to join him in the shade. "Kawis, you survived your first night," the chief observed. "Aminata said you nearly didn't." "She saved me from my own instincts," Traoré admitted. "Chief, I need to understand more. How did this start? When did the militants begin these psychological tactics?" Sawadogo was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the village with the practiced vigilance of a leader who knows safety is always conditional. "It began about 4 months after the initial attack," he said finally. "At first, when they returned, they tried to break down doors with makeshift battering rams, crude but effective. We reinforced our entrances, made them stronger. So they switched tactics. They realized that our minds were more vulnerable than our doors. The recordings, the threats. Where did they learn that? Who knows? Perhaps from conflicts elsewhere. Perhaps they developed it themselves. What matters is that it works. Psychological warfare costs them nothing. No ammunition, no casualties, no risk. They just have to be persistent." A woman approached carrying a baby on her back, both wrapped in brightly colored fabric. She whispered something to the chief, who nodded and replied in Mure. After she left, Sawadogo turned back to Traoré. "That was Madame Ouattara. Her husband died in the first attack, the one 6 months ago. She wanted to know if the visitor would be joining us for the communal meal this evening. I told her yes." "The communal meal?" Traoré asked. One of our adaptations. Every evening before sunset, we share a meal together. Everyone who can make it. We eat. We talk. We remind ourselves why we endure the nights. It helps. Community is its own form of medicine. Traoré spent the day observing more closely, talking to people when they seemed willing to share. He met Boubacar, a young man who'd been a teacher in Bobo Dioulasso, but returned to Tangaye after the first attack to help protect his aging parents. Boubacar had taken over education duties in the village, teaching children under the mango tree using whatever materials they could gather or make themselves. "People ask why I came back," Boubacar said, as they watched the children practice writing letters in the dirt with sticks. "I had a good job, a comfortable life. But what kind of son abandons his parents when they need him most? What kind of teacher stays in the city while children in his own village grow up without education? Do you regret it?" Traoré asked. Boubacar considered the question. "Regret implies I had a real choice. I didn't. Once I knew what was happening here, there was only one path forward. That's not bravery, it's just being human." Later, Traoré helped with afternoon chores, carrying water from the well, assisting with repairs to a damaged roof. The physical labor was grounding, a reminder of simple causality. Work produced results. Sweat earned progress. It was a relief from the abstract complexity of presidential decision-making, where every action spawned unforeseen consequences. As the sun began its descent, people gradually moved toward the communal area. Women brought large pots of rice and peanut sauce, two with vegetable stew, grilled meat seasoned with spices that made Traoré some mouthwater. Children helped arrange seating, logs, stones, mats spread on the ground. The atmosphere was almost festive, determinedly so. Chief Sawadogo stood when everyone had gathered, perhaps 100 people of all ages. He raised his hands for silence. "We have a visitor among us," he announced in Moure, then repeated in French for Traoré's benefit, though by now Traoré suspected most people knew exactly who their guest was. "He has come to understand how we live. Tonight, as we share this meal, let us show him that we are not defined by what happens in the darkness. We are defined by how we choose to live in the light." The meal was extraordinary, not because of the food, though it was delicious, but because of the atmosphere. People laughed, told stories, sang songs. Children performed a traditional dance they'd learned from Boubacar, their movements precise and joyful. An old man played the balafon, the wooden keys producing notes that seemed to carry centuries of history in their resonance. Traoré found himself seated next to Madame Ouattara, the widow with the baby. She fed the child with practiced ease while participating in conversation with those around her. When she noticed Traoré watching, she smiled. "You're wondering how I can smile," she said in French, "after losing my husband." "I'm sorry for your loss," Traoré replied, meaning it deeply. "Don't be sorry, be useful." That's what he would have said. She shifted the baby to her other arm. "My husband believed that grief without action was just another form of death. So I grieve by living, by raising our daughter, by being part of this community that he died protecting." "How do you stay strong?" "I don't," Madame Ouattara said simply. "I break every day, but I break in private, in my home, where my daughter can't see. And then I come out here and I find strength in everyone else's brokenness. We hold each other up. That's the secret. None of us are strong enough alone, but together we're unbreakable." As the evening deepened, the character of the gathering changed subtly. The laughter became more deliberate, the conversations more intentional. People began moving toward their homes, saying goodbyes with an intensity that suggested finality rather than simple parting. Mothers pulled children close. Men embraced with fierce grips. It was a ritual of preparation, Traoré realized, a collective acknowledgement of what was coming and a mutual reinforcement of resolve. Chief Sawadogo found Traoré as the communal area emptied. "Tonight will be different," the chief said. "Last night they tested you personally. Tonight they'll test the community. You'll hear things that will make you question whether staying locked inside is the right choice. You'll wonder if intervention might save lives. Will it? No. Opening doors only creates targets. But knowing that intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different things. That's the second lesson of Tangaye, understanding that sometimes the hardest choice and the right choice are the same thing. As Traoré walked back to his guest house, the sun was touching the horizon. Around him, doors were closing, beams sliding into place, the village transforming into its nighttime configuration. Aminata appeared again, slipping through the connecting passage just as he secured his own door. "Back for night too?" Traoré asked. "Someone has to make sure you don't do anything heroic and stupid," she replied with a slight smile. Then her expression turned serious. "Tonight will be harder than last night. Tonight they'll make it sound like they're breaking into other houses, hurting people you've met. Your instinct will be to help. You can't. How do you know what they'll do? Because they follow a pattern. Night 1 is personal intimidation. Night 2 is community threat. Night 3, she paused. We'll discuss that when it comes." Darkness fell quickly, as it always did in this region, and with the darkness came the sounds. But Aminata was right. Tonight was different. The voices weren't directed at Traoré's door. Instead, they seemed to be at other houses, battering at doors, shouting names of people Traoré had met during the day. He heard Chief Sawadogo's name bellowed into the night, heard threats against his family, heard Boubacar's voice, or a recording of it, he couldn't tell, screaming for help, heard what sounded like Madame Ouattara's baby crying in distress. Traoré's hands clenched into fists. Every fiber of his being demanded action. He was the president, the commander of the armed forces, a man trained to protect, and he was sitting in a locked room, listening to people he'd broken bread with apparently being terrorized. "It's not real," Aminata said, but even she sounded less certain than the previous night. "They're just sounds, tricks. How can you be sure?" "Because we've survived it before. Because Chief Sawadogo is safe in his house with his family, just as Boubacar is safe, just as Madame Ouattara is safe. The sounds are designed to create panic, to make us break our discipline." But the sounds grew worse. Glass breaking, doors splintering, screams that sounded far too authentic. Traoré moved to the window despite himself, trying to see something, anything. The darkness revealed nothing. "This is madness," he said. "We should fight back, organize a defense." "With what?" Aminata challenged. "A few hunting rifles against automatic weapons, in the dark where they have every advantage. We tried that, President Traoré. The first month after the attack, men tried to form patrol groups to actively defend the village. 12 of them died in 3 weeks. That's when we learned that resistance isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about denial. Denying them targets, denying them satisfaction, denying them the chaos they need to operate effectively." Traoré sank down against the wall, feeling defeated in a way he hadn't since the early days of his presidency, when the enormity of Burkina Faso's challenges had first become clear. "This is what my failure looks like," he said quietly. "A village living in fear, people locked in their homes every night, communities developing survival strategies because the state can't protect them. Your failure," Aminata's voice carried an edge. "President Traoré, with respect, this isn't about you. This is about a reality that existed before you took power and will exist after you leave it. The question isn't whose fault it is. Blame is cheap and useless. The question is what you're going to do about it. What can I do? I have an army spread across multiple fronts, resources that can't meet the need, political pressures from every direction. I came here to escape that impossibility, and instead I've found it distilled to its essence." "Good," Aminata said firmly. "Then maybe now you'll understand what real leadership looks like. It's not grand speeches or military victories. It's Chief Sawadogo making fair judgments about land disputes while carrying the weight of dead villagers. It's Madame Ouattara raising her daughter with joy despite her grief. It's Boubacar teaching children to write when he could be safely in the city. That's leadership. Showing up, enduring, refusing to quit even when quitting would be easier." Her words hit like physical blows, each one true and painful. Outside, the manufactured chaos continued. But inside this small room, Traoré felt something shift. The weight he'd been carrying, the burden of responsibility that had driven him to seek escape, suddenly felt different. Not lighter, but redistributed somehow. "Tell me," he said, "how does Tangaye survive this night after night without losing hope?" "We remember the mornings," Aminata replied. "We remember that darkness always ends. We remember that we have each other. And we remember that survival itself is a form of victory." They sat together through the long hours of the night, Aminata sharing more stories of the village, of the people who'd found ways to maintain humanity, in impossible circumstances. She told him about the teacher who'd started a secret library, books passed from house to house during the day, creating a network of learning that the militants couldn't destroy. About the teenagers who'd organized a messenger system, using daylight hours to maintain connections with other villages facing similar challenges. About the grandmother who'd documented everything in a journal, creating a record so that someday people would know what they'd endured. "These are your soldiers," Aminata said. "Not the ones with guns, but the ones with books and hope and stubborn refusal to surrender their humanity. If you want to lead them, you need to understand what they're fighting for." As dawn approached and the sounds outside gradually faded, Traoré felt exhausted, but somehow clearer than he'd been in months. The second night had taught him what the first could not, that strength came in forms he'd never been trained to recognize, that courage wasn't always loud or visible, and that leadership sometimes meant learning from those you were supposed to protect. When the first light broke and Aminata slipped away through the passage, Traoré opened his door to find Chief Sawadago waiting outside, very much alive and unharmed, just as Aminata had promised. "2 nights down," the chief said. "1 more to go. Think you can handle it?" Traoré met the older man's eyes and saw not a challenge but an invitation to truly understand, to fully experience what his people endured. "Yes," he said, "I can handle it. But the question is, after I leave here, what am I going to do with what I've learned?" Chief Sawadago smiled, the first genuine smile Traoré had seen from him. "Now you're asking the right questions," the chief said. "Come, let's have breakfast. You'll need your strength for tonight." Chapter 6. The second day in Tangaye passed differently for Traoré. Where he'd spent the first day as an observer, he now participated more fully, helping with the rhythm of village life. He joined men repairing a section of the communal grain storage, their conversation flowing easily around work that required attention but not constant thought. There was Dramain, a man perhaps 40, who'd been a truck driver before the security situation made long-distance transport too dangerous. Now he farmed, supplementing the village food supply with whatever he could coax from the difficult soil. "The drought makes everything harder," Dramain explained as they lifted a heavy beam into place. "But we've learned to adapt. Drought is predictable, you know it's coming, you can prepare. Armed groups are different. They're unpredictable, chaotic. That's what makes them more dangerous." Traoré helped secure the beam with rope, his military training making him precise in his knots. "How do you maintain hope in the face of that unpredictability?" Dramain paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Hope is a luxury we can't always afford. What we have instead is determination. Hope is about believing things will get better. Determination is about making things less worse. It's a subtle difference, but important." At the school under the mango tree, Traoré sat with Boubacar as the young teacher worked with students ranging from 6 to 16. The curriculum was improvised but comprehensive. Reading, mathematics, history, even English and basic computer literacy, taught through textbooks Boubacar had brought from the city and carefully preserved. A girl of about 14, Fatou, was helping younger students with their writing. She worked with patience and clarity, and when Traoré complimented her teaching, she smiled shyly. "I want to be a doctor," she said. "Boubacar says, if I keep studying, maybe someday I can go to university, even though—" She trailed off, glancing toward the village perimeter, toward the world beyond that had become so dangerous. "Even though the situation is difficult," Traoré prompted. "Even though people like me don't usually become doctors," Fatou finished. "Village girls, I mean. But Boubacar says the world is changing, that we have to change with it, or we'll be left behind." Boubacar joined them, settling on the ground with easy familiarity. "Education is the one thing they can't take from us," he said. "They can control our movements, limit our resources, terrorize our nights. But what these children learn, what they carry in their minds, that's forever theirs." Traoré felt a tightness in his chest. This was what was at stake, not just immediate security, but the future itself. Every child who couldn't go to school, every dream deferred because of violence, was a piece of Burkina Faso's potential stolen. In the afternoon, Traoré met with a group of women who managed the village's food supplies, coordinating what was grown, what was stored, what was distributed. The organizational complexity was impressive. They'd developed systems for tracking inventory, managing distribution during difficult periods, ensuring no family went without even when supplies were thin. Mariam, who led the group, showed Traoré their record-keeping, a series of notebooks filled with neat columns of numbers and notes. Before the Troubles, we did this casually, she explained, but now precision matters. We can't afford waste or miscalculation. Every grain of millet, every measure of rice, it all has to be accounted for because we never know when the next supply delivery will come. Do you get regular deliveries? Mariam shrugged. Sometimes, the government sends food aid occasionally, though it often gets diverted or stolen before it reaches us. NGOs help when they can access the region. Mostly, we rely on what we produce ourselves and what we can trade with other villages during safe periods. I'm sorry, Traoré said, the inadequacy of the words burning his throat. The state should be doing more. The state is doing what it can, Mariam replied, not unkindly. We understand the challenges. What frustrates us is when officials in Ouagadougou make decisions about our lives without understanding how we actually live. Theory and reality are different things. As the day progressed toward evening, Traoré noticed the familiar pattern of acceleration, work intensifying, conversations becoming more purposeful, the subtle shift in atmosphere as people prepared for another night. But today he also noticed something else, a kind of peace in the routine, a comfort in the predictability of their defensive ritual. The communal evening meal gathered even more people than the previous night. Chief Ouagadougou explained that word had spread about their visitor, and people wanted to meet him, to share their stories. Traoré found himself at the center of conversations about everything, from agricultural techniques to national politics, from children's education to the future of Burkina Faso. One elderly man, Soleimani, who'd served in the army during the 1980s, engaged Traoré in a discussion about military strategy. The problem with modern counterinsurgency, Soleimani argued, is that it focuses on eliminating enemies rather than creating allies. You can kill 1,000 militants, and 2,000 will take their place if the underlying conditions that breed militancy remain unchanged. What would you do differently? Traoré asked, genuinely curious. I'd invest as much in wells, schools, and clinics as in weapons and ammunition. I'd make sure that government officials treated rural communities with respect instead of contempt. I'd create opportunities for young men so they don't see joining armed groups as their only path to significance. Soleimani paused, his weathered face thoughtful. But I'm just an old soldier from a forgotten village. What do I know? More than most people in positions of power, Traoré replied quietly. As sunset approached and people began moving toward their homes, Chief Ouagadougou pulled Traoré aside. Tonight is your third night, the chief said, the final test. What makes it different from the others? The first night, they tested you personally. The second night, they tested your commitment to the community. Tonight, the chief's expression grew grave. Tonight they'll test your understanding of sacrifice. What does that mean? You'll see, but remember, whatever happens, whatever you hear, the door stays closed. That's the rule that keeps us alive. Back in the guest house, Traoré waited for Aminata, but she didn't come. He was alone as darkness fell, alone as he heard the familiar sounds begin. Footsteps, voices, the orchestrated chaos designed to break will and nerve. But tonight, as Chief Ouagadougou had warned, it was different. The voices called out a name, Boubacar. We know you're in there, teacher. We have your student Fatou. If you want her back alive, open your door. You have 10 minutes. Traoré's blood ran cold. He moved to the window, peering through the shutters. In the moonlight, he could just make out figures near what he thought was Boubacar's house. And they weren't alone. There was someone with them, a smaller figure, struggling. It couldn't be real. It had to be another trick, another recording or staged performance. But what if it wasn't? What if they'd actually taken Fatou? Could Boubacar hear this? Would the young teacher break, sacrifice himself for his student? Minutes passed in agony. The voice counted down. 5 minutes, teacher. Then we start hurting her. You want that on your conscience? Traoré's hand was on his doorbeam before he realized he'd moved. If this was real, if they actually had Fatou, he couldn't let an innocent girl suffer. President or not, soldier or not, some things demanded action. But then another voice came through the darkness, strong and clear. Boubacar's voice, calling from his house. Fatou is safe inside with her family. I checked before sunset. You're lying. A moment of silence. Then laughter from outside, cruel and satisfied. Smart teacher, but we'll get you eventually. All of you. The figures melted back into the darkness. The smaller person they'd been holding, a dummy, Traoré realized with shaking relief, was left behind as a testament to the deception. He sank against the wall, heart pounding. They'd almost gotten him, almost gotten Boubacar. The sophistication of the psychological warfare was terrifying, using real names, real relationships, creating scenarios specific enough to be believable. The night continued with variations on the theme. More voices, more specific threats, more elaborate deceptions designed to make villagers doubt their collective security. But nobody opened their doors. Nobody broke rank. The discipline held. Traoré spent the hours analyzing what he was experiencing. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic, methodical, designed to achieve specific objectives. The militants had studied this community, understood its bonds and relationships, weaponized its very humanity against itself. And yet Tangaye survived. Night after night, they endured. Not through superior firepower or external protection, but through communal discipline and mutual trust, through the courage to remain locked inside, even when everything screamed at them to act. As dawn approached, Traoré understood Chief Sawadogo's point about sacrifice. The people of Tangaye sacrificed their agency every night, surrendered their ability to act in favor of collective security. They sacrificed the heroic individual response in favor of communal survival. It was a different kind of courage than charging into battle, but no less profound. When morning came and he emerged into the clean light of day, Traoré saw Boubacar near the school area, already preparing for the day's lessons. Fatou was there too, helping arrange materials, very much alive and safe. Boubacar saw Traoré approaching and smiled wearily. "I heard it too." "Yes, I nearly opened my door." "So did I. Every time they use her name, it takes everything I have not to run out there." He paused, watching Fatou laugh at something another student said. "But she's counting on me to be smart, not brave. All of them are." "How do you bear it?" "By remembering that opening my door wouldn't save anyone. It would just create another casualty." The hardest lesson Tangaye teaches is that sometimes doing nothing is doing something. Sometimes survival is the victory. Chief Sawadogo found them both, his expression showing relief that both had endured the night intact. "3 nights completed," the chief said to Traoré. "You've experienced what we live with every day. The question now is what you'll do with that knowledge." Traoré looked around the village, at the people emerging from their homes to face another day, at children heading towards school, at women gathering water, at men preparing for field work. Life continuing because people refuse to let fear stop it. "I'm going to remember," Traoré said. "Every time I make a decision in Ouagadougou, every time I allocate resources or approve a strategy, I'm going to remember Tangaye. I'm going to remember that my theories and plans affect real people in real villages, and that understanding their reality is essential to serving them properly." "Good," Chief Sawadogo said. "But remembering isn't enough. You have to act." "I know, and I will. But I also know now that I can't solve this from the capital. The solution has to include voices like yours, experiences like Aminata's, wisdom like Solimane's. Top-down imposition won't work. It has to be collaborative." The chief nodded slowly. "Then perhaps your visit here hasn't been wasted. Come, let's have breakfast. Your driver will arrive this afternoon to take you back. Make your last hours here count. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content like this." Chapter 7. Traoré's final hours in Tangaye were spent in deep conversation with the community leaders, not just Chief Sawadogo, but the council of elders who helped make decisions, the women who managed resources, the young people who represented the village's future. They gathered in the chief's compound, a larger structure with multiple rooms built around a central courtyard, where a magnificent baobab tree provided shade. Aminata was there, and Traoré learned that she wasn't just a visitor, but Chief Sawadogo's niece, someone who'd chosen to divide her time between Ouagadougou and Tangaye, serving as a bridge between rural reality and urban policymaking. She worked with several NGOs focused on rural development and security, translating Tangaye's experiences into advocacy for better approaches. "The problem with most interventions," Aminata explained as the group settled into discussion, "is that they're designed in conference rooms by people who've never spent a night behind locked doors, listening to their names being called by militants. They mean well, but they don't understand the granular reality of how communities like ours survive. Give me an example, Traoré said, pulling out a small notebook he'd borrowed from Boubacar. Security sector reform, Mariam offered. Every few years, some new initiative comes through promising better protection for rural areas. They talk about deploying more gendarmes, creating rapid response units, improving coordination. All good in theory. But in practice, Traoré prompted. In practice, gendarmes come through maybe once a month if we're lucky, Dramane said. They ask questions, write reports, then leave. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the militants seem to know exactly when the gendarmes have departed, and they come through shortly after. Makes you wonder about information sharing. Traoré felt his jaw tighten. He knew about corruption in the security forces, about officers who supplemented their meager salaries by selling information or looking the other way. It was one of the cancers eating at Burkina Faso's stability. What would actually help? He asked. The discussion that followed was remarkable for its practicality. These weren't people engaging in abstract theorizing. They were proposing concrete solutions based on lived experience. Soleimani, the former soldier, argued for a different approach to community defense. Instead of trying to deploy state security forces everywhere, which is impossible, create a hybrid model. Train local defense volunteers properly, not just in weapons use, but in intelligence gathering, de-escalation, community coordination. Give them legal authority and resources. Let communities like ours take primary responsibility for our own security, with state forces providing support and backup rather than trying to be everywhere at once. That's what the VDP program tried to do, Aminata pointed out, referring to the volunteers for the defense of the homeland that Traoré's government had expanded. But implementation was rushed, training was inadequate, and accountability mechanisms were weak. Some VDP units became as much a problem as the militants. Because it was designed top-down instead of bottom-up, Chief Sawadago said, you can't just decree that communities will defend themselves and expect it to work. You have to build on existing structures, respect local knowledge, and provide genuine support rather than just symbolic authority. They talked about economic development, and here too, the insights were pointed. A cooperative rice farming initiative had failed because the designers hadn't understood local land tenure systems. A well drilling project had collapsed because it didn't include maintenance training or sustainable funding for repairs. A vaccination program had struggled because it didn't account for the realities of nighttime lockdowns and restricted movement. It's not that these programs were bad ideas, Boubacar explained. It's that they were good ideas badly implemented because the implementers didn't truly understand our context. They visited for a day, talked to a few people, then went back to their offices and designed solutions that looked perfect on paper but couldn't survive contact with reality. So, how do we fix that? Traoré asked. How do we bridge the gap between policy design and implementation reality? You start by listening, Aminata said. Truly listening, not just performing consultation as a box-checking exercise. You start by putting people with actual field experience into decision-making roles, not just having them as advisors who can be ignored. You start by measuring success based on community outcomes rather than bureaucratic metrics. Fatou, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. You start by remembering that we're not problems to be solved. We're people with agency and intelligence and understanding of our own circumstances. Work with us, not on us. The wisdom in those words from a 14-year-old was humbling. Traoré had come to Tangaye thinking he would observe how rural communities survived. Instead, he was receiving a masterclass in participatory governance from people the government apparatus routinely ignored. As the sun climbed toward noon, the conversation shifted to specifics. What could actually be done? What changes could be implemented that would make a real difference? They developed a list, practical and prioritized. First, improve communication infrastructure. The isolation that helped protect Tangaye also made it vulnerable. Better radio communication would allow faster coordination during crises, better intelligence sharing, quicker response times. Second, support existing community structures rather than imposing new ones. Tangaye had developed effective governance mechanisms. Strengthen these rather than replacing them with bureaucratic alternatives. Third, address basic needs systematically. The nightly lockdowns meant traditional markets couldn't function normally. support local food production and storage, ensure medical supplies were pre-positioned within communities rather than requiring dangerous travel to access them. Fourth, create education continuity programs that recognize the constraints communities faced. Support teachers like Boubacar, who were doing heroic work with minimal resources. Fifth, reform security force training to emphasize community protection rather than just combat operations. Teach soldiers and gendarmes to see rural populations as partners rather than potential collaborators with militants. The list grew, each item rooted in specific experiences and needs. Traoré wrote feverishly, asking questions, challenging assumptions, pushing for clarity. This was what he'd needed, not abstract policy recommendations from international consultants, but concrete proposals from people who lived the reality every day. "This is valuable," Traoré said as they paused for a meal brought by several women, "but I need to be honest with you. Implementation will be difficult. Resources are limited. Political opposition will be significant. Some of what you're proposing goes against established interests." "We know," Chief Sawadogo said. "We're not naive about politics. But we also know that incremental change is better than no change. If you can implement even a fraction of these ideas, if you can shift the approach even slightly toward genuine community partnership, it would make a difference." After the meal, Traoré walked the village one final time, trying to memorize details. The children's laughter from the school area, the rhythmic sound of women pounding millet, the way afternoon light caught the dust rising from men working distant fields. He wanted to carry this with him, to have it accessible when he was back in the capital, making decisions that felt abstract, but had consequences exactly this concrete. He found Madame Ouattara near her home, her baby sleeping peacefully in the shade while she sorted beans. She looked up as he approached, her smile warm but also knowing. "You're leaving soon," she observed. "Yes, back to Ouagadougou this afternoon. And what will you take with you?" Traoré considered the question carefully. Understanding, I hope, humility, certainly, and a commitment to do better. "That's a start," Madame Ouattara said, "but understanding without action is just another form of abandonment. My husband used to say that. He said the worst thing wasn't people who didn't understand our struggles. It was people who understood, but didn't care enough to act." "I care," Traoré said quietly, "more now than when I arrived. I believe you, but caring is also just the start. What matters is what you do with that caring. Whether you let it fade when you return to comfort and power, or whether you let it fuel real change." She returned to sorting beans, and Traoré stood there, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, of course. The real test wouldn't be surviving 3 nights in Tangail. It would be whether his experience here translated into meaningful action or just became another story he told at diplomatic dinners. The land cruiser arrived in early afternoon, dust rising from its approach across the savannah. Captain Ouedraogo stepped out, his face showing relief at seeing Traoré safe. "Sir, you had us worried. No communication for 3 days." "I'm fine, Captain. Better than fine, actually." Traoré turned to Chief Sawadogo, who'd come to see him off. "Thank you for your hospitality, your honesty, and your patience with a president who had much to learn." "The learning is ongoing," the chief replied, "as is our struggle. Remember us when you're back in the capital. Remember that every decision you make ripples outward to villages like ours." "I will, and I'll be back, Chief. Not as a president seeking escape, but as a partner seeking collaboration. What we discussed today, I'm going to make it happen, not all at once, but progressively, systematically." Aminata appeared, carrying a small wrapped package. "Something to remember us by," she said, handing it to him. Traoré unwrapped it to find a notebook, the journal Aminata had mentioned, where the grandmother had documented Tangail's experiences. It was filled with neat handwriting in French and Moore, chronicling attacks, survival strategies, community decisions, personal reflections. "This is too valuable," Traoré protested. "You should keep it." "We have copies," Aminata assured him, "but we want you to have this one. Read it when you're making decisions. Let our voices speak to you through these pages. Let us remind you of what's at stake." Traoré embraced her, then Chief Sawadogo, then others who'd gathered to see him off. Boubacar, Fatou, Mariam, Draman, Madame Ouattara with her baby, Solimane, each person a story, each story a reminder of the human cost of policy failures and the human benefit of policy successes. As the Land Cruiser pulled away, Traoré looked back at Tangaye, at the village that had taught him more in 3 days than months of presidential briefings. He watched until it disappeared from view, swallowed by distance and dust, but not from memory. Never from memory. The drive back to Ouagadougou passed in contemplative silence. Ouedraogo had the wisdom not to interrupt Traoré's thoughts with unnecessary questions. The landscape reversed its transformation, from harsh savanna to developed countryside to urban sprawl, from isolation to connectivity, from simplicity to complexity. But Traoré knew now that the apparent simplicity of Tangaye had been an illusion. Life there was extraordinarily complex, requiring constant adaptation, collective discipline, and sophisticated community coordination. The real simplicity was in Ouagadougou, where problems could be reduced to policy papers and solutions proposed without having to live with their consequences. As they entered the capital with its traffic and noise and millions of people going about their lives, Traoré felt the weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders, but it felt different now, not lighter, but more focused. He knew what he was carrying and why it mattered. The presidential compound appeared ahead, its walls and security checkpoints a stark contrast to the unlocked openness of Tangaye's daylight hours and the locked determination of its nights. Traoré was returning to power, to authority, to the machinery of government. But he was returning changed, carrying with him the voices of people who'd shown him what real leadership looked like. Captain Ouedraogo pulled up to the entrance, where other aides were waiting with urgent briefings and stacked schedules. The normal chaos of presidential life ready to reassert itself. But before stepping out, Traoré placed his hand on the journal Aminata had given him, a promise to himself and to Tangaye. This experience would not become just memory, it would become action. "Captain," he said to Ouedraogo, "clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. I need time to think and plan, and schedule a meeting with the Security Council for the afternoon. We're going to discuss a new approach to community defense and rural security." "Yes, sir. Anything else?" "Yes. Find me someone from the Ministry of Rural Development who's actually spent time in rural areas, not just visited for photo opportunities. I want someone who understands how villages actually function." As Traoré stepped out of the vehicle and back into his role as president, he carried with him the weight of 3 nights locked behind doors, listening to the voices of those who wanted to break the community's will. But he also carried the strength of those who'd endured those nights with grace and determination, who'd shown him that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust in collective discipline rather than individual heroics. Tangaye had taught him well. Now came the harder part, putting those lessons into practice.